Thank you very much for coming to this session. We may have one or two more people joining us, but I think we'll get kicked off so that we can get to the next coffee break on time. So my name is Jenny O'Neill. I'm a Research Engagement Officer with HEANet, which is Ireland's National Research and Education Network. And I'm also the co-chair of the EOSC Data Retention, Long-Term Data Retention Task Force, together with my colleague Jacques Flores from Utrecht University. So we in the task force are very interested in looking at the active appraisal, but also then reappraisal, so that we can try to keep things fair over time. So it's not just a one-off process. I was really lucky to be able to come to Berlin a few days early and spent a little bit of time wandering around this gorgeous city. And one of the places that I visited was the East Side Gallery. So this is a group of, I think, 118 artists from a number of different countries came together in 1990, just after the wall fell, to paint these beautiful murals directly onto the Berlin Wall on the east side of the wall. It's really gorgeous, and I would recommend you go and have a look. But what I started to think about as I was reading more about the artworks was that these were preserved and conserved in 2009. So they actually had to reinforce the wall in places. A lot of the paintings were repainted either exactly as they were or updated by the artists themselves. And this really got me thinking about, because I just can't help myself, about the act of appraisal of the artists who were presumably invited to come and paint these artworks in the first place. And then the process of reappraisal of, do we hold on to these? Do we keep these into the future? And I'm not a social scientist or an art historian or a city planner, so I definitely have nothing to say about whether it should or should not have been preserved. But it really just got me thinking about this act of appraisal and then reappraisal. And as I was walking along, I noticed in one or two spots, because it's obviously an outdoor gallery, which has been painted onto a wall, which was not designed to be a canvas, that there are areas in which there's a little bit of decay happening again. So obviously this is something which will have to be reappraised again at some point in the future. But also, as I was walking along, I noticed that a lot of the artists, presumably in the newer version of their paintings, had included phone numbers, email addresses, and website addresses. And I was kind of thinking, I bet none of those have a DOI, because I really can't help myself. And I was thinking, how many of the websites, what percentage of these websites actually still exist? Are these kind of the types of objects that we should be preserving along with the artworks to help give more context in the future? And then as I walked a little bit further, and myself and the hundreds of other people who were there kept taking pictures after picture after picture, and I thought, there's something missing from these murals. There are no Instagram tags, there are no Instagram usernames, or that little square logo that we're all familiar with. And so again, I started thinking about how the community's needs change over time. So now we would expect that you would have an Instagram profile on something like a public artwork like this. And are there additional objects that we need to preserve along with the actual data or the paintings to give broader context to it? And then finally, each of the paintings had this little plaque down the front, which had a little QR code on it, and you could scan the QR code and get to additional information about that artwork. And again, this kind of got me thinking about, okay, well, we need to not just be preserving the artworks, but also the websites that give the context, the artist's website, but also the website of the people who have been tasked with preserving and providing access to these artworks. So just gives you a little brief insight into how my mind works as I'm being a tourist in this gorgeous city. But I'm really excited today to have three wonderful panelists with us. First up will be Olivier Rouchon. He is from the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, and he is chair of the Core Trust Seal Board. Next up, we will have Mickey Linlar, and they lead the digital preservation team at the TIB Leibniz Information Centre for Science and Technology. And then finally, we will have Marie Clémola, I tried, who is the development manager for the Finnish Social Science Data Archive, and is also chairs the CESDA Trust and Landscape Working Group. So we've got a really great team of panel here today. They're each going to do a very brief introduction to themselves with a little presentation, and then we will move to a Q&A section. So with the Q&A, you're aware that we're using Slido. The details were shared on the screen already. And we will have the Slido questions up on the screen afterwards. So my hope would be to try and get a mixture of questions from the audience and also then from the Slido as well. So first up, I will hand over to Olivier.
So, this one. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss data retention. So my name is Olivier Auchan. I'm a research data officer at CNRS, but also, and that's probably why I'm here today, I'm the chair of the board of the Core Trust Seal, which, as you may know, is a certification body for trustworthy digital or data repositories. So I'm going to talk about what we could do as part of the long-term data retention task force. So I'll start with the title or the name of the task force itself, long-term data retention. So what is meant? What do we mean by long-term, right? Is a number of years sufficient to describe what long-term is? And if you want an answer, to be honest, I'll have the same one. If you were in this room in the previous session, I'll have the same answer as the legal expert. It depends, right? It depends. Why does it depend? Because I think that long-term can vary from a repository to another, depending on your assets, your objective, your mission, and things like that. I would say that the long term is the period of time which is long enough so that you may be impacted by risks. And these risks can be technological risks, but also governance, finance, etc., etc. But I think that as part of the task force, we will focus on the technological risks. That is to say, format or media obsolescence, for example. Right? I'm sure that my colleagues will talk about that later on. So next term is retention. And then you will see that the task force is the continuation of the previous task force, which was named long-term data preservation. So we have changed the name from preservation to retention. I suppose that it's to widen the scope of the task force. Because at this stage, when we talk about the risks, different risks may imply different level of creation, right? Different preservation or retention strategy based on these risks, the objectives, the value of your assets, and that's where the appraisal and reappraisal is very important. At Core Trust Seal, we've worked on the subject, right? And we have defined some level of creation, which, by the way, have been endorsed by the previous task force because these are explicitly quoted in the deliverable that the task force produced. So we've got a Core Trust Seal position paper that you can have a look at. It's on Zenodo. Unfortunately, there's just the link here. I should have put the DOI to access it. But I mean, it's pretty straightforward to get it on Zenodo. And from that position paper, we have a discussion paper ongoing about different typologies or a typology of digital repository. And I suggest that you have a look at it. This is a community work, and we are really looking for feedback on these. So why are we looking for feedback on these? Because these could have an impact on the certification. At the moment, the Core Trust Seal is very much oriented to active preservation. And I know that even if the core trust seal is pretty simple, there are only 16 requirements and things like that, people think that it's a little bit too complex. So we could try to widen the scope of certification to other type of repositories doing some lower level of curation. So I strongly encourage you to have a look at the discussion paper and provide feedback if you want. So what's next then? And what can we do with the task force? We could try to help to go towards a network of trusted digital repositories. I think that trust is transitive, right? By that I mean that if you trust me and I trust someone else, you will trust that someone else as well. So we really need to build such a network, right? But I would say that the core trust seal can be seen as an already existing network of trusted digital repositories. We've got at the moment more than 170 certified repositories worldwide. These repositories, the certification is discipline agnostic, right? There are experts, reviewers, peers that can do the reviews. There are documented processes. So maybe that we can start from there and try to go towards a wider, bigger network of trusted digital repositories. So that would mean collaboration with the task force, with emerging projects that my colleagues may talk about later on. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to such a collaboration. That's me done. Thank you very much.
Here we go. Thank you. All right. So the task what we were given to think about was to think about some impulses that we want to give for long-term data retention or data retention in general. So this is what I came up with. So the first thing is, let's look at a definition of what data retention actually means, right? So if we look at Wikipedia, maybe not the trusted of all sources, since we're speaking about trust, but a source used frequently nevertheless, it says that data retention defines policies of persistent data and records management for meeting legal and business data archival requirements. So legal and business data doesn't say anything about research data, right? So we as a domain are missing there, but still we can learn something and we clearly fit into that picture too. So let's see how data retention is typically broken down. It's broken down into different kind of spans, time spans. So if we think about a time span of a data retention of 0 to 5 years, to take an example from that business data, from the legal and business data archival side, that will be, for example, internet service providers or telecommunication customer data, which is required, depending on where you live, to be stored for 6 months to a year. And on the research data side of things, many universities, for example, or other institutions have research data policies that actually go beyond the 10-year frame. So they require their institutes to store their research data for 3 years, for example. That's common practice. If we look a little bit at the longer, or the next step up, think about 10 years. 10 years for research data is considered good scientific practice. That's how long we all want to store data. If we look at the business data and legal data, an example for that would be electronic invoices, which are required to be stored for 10 years. So again, 10 years is something that is frequently used across the globe. Then we take a bit of a bigger step up, 25 years. From our research data domain, clinical trial data is something that we might be familiar with that is typically stored for that long. In the business domain, manufacturing engineering data, especially if it's related to safety requirements or environmental standard compliance, is required to be stored for that long as well. And then from there up, there's no more stopping us, right? It goes to eternity. So the indefinitely stored data. For research data, or data that we might be familiar with, it's cultural heritage data, but also certain public records that we already know that are required to be stored indefinitely. In the public domain, an example would be information related to radioactive waste management, which is required to be stored for that long. Some radioactive waste management data management plans give it a time frame, but sometimes it's 1,000 to 3,000 years long. So I think for the sake of argument, we can consider that forever. But the question that I have is, when does the long term actually start when we look at that time scale? So that leads me to the next question, is long-term data retention risk on a schedule? And let's approach this backwards. On the indefinite kind of side, this is typically where people have stone tablets, for example, but I'm too nerdy for that, and also I didn't want to miss the chance to have Alice Cooper and Donkey Kong in a single slide. So there's some older data carriers here that some might remember, some might not remember. Some have metadata on it, like the punch card from LWTH Aachen, so one of the German universities. But there's also like a U-matic tape and an 8-track, so it's older media. The data carriers might not be readable anymore, and we don't really know what's on them. All right, so that says a lot about the file formats or the information that's stored on them as well. But even if we take it one step back to the 25-year scale, there's a lot of data carriers that we might not have the equipment for anymore. So, I mean, CDs are still fairly common, but if we think about the DDS, it's the tape up on the right, for example, it was a data carrier that was very frequently used in backup prior to LTO tapes, and they came with a whole set of problems that weren't fun to work with in computing centers. So again, here we have examples of data carriers that are only, in parentheses, 25 years old, but we already don't really know how to handle them, and the same can be said for the files on them. So now you might say, hey, Mickey, you're just talking about data carriers, we have it all in managed storage. But then if we take it even a step further back, this is a real-life example. So all these are real-life examples, either from my own collection or from TIB's collection. This is a real-life example of a TIFF file, and it's a broken TIFF file, right? You might be able to see that it's broken. You might not be able to see that it's broken. What happens is it just repeats the entire lines over and over again. There was actually something, it was a scan of a plan. So there's supposed to be something on there, but this TIFF file is broken. And to give an even more recent example, in the 0 to 5 year span, this PDF file came in that way. And I'm not a mathematician, but even I can tell that something is wrong with this formula. And the PDF file didn't throw an error, right? And this was hidden on page, I think, 300 something out of a 1,200 page proceeding. So it's not something that you can easily spot by just opening the PDF file and rendering it and testing it. So what we already see is that risk is something that occurs from the point of data creation onwards, and risk on a schedule does not exist. At least that's my opinion. I'm happy to discuss that with anyone. So let's look at reappraisal then. When does that typically happen? There's clearly initial appraisal that occurs when data enters our system, and then sometimes there's handover appraisal when it's handed over to a second repository or to a longer archive. And when we think about appraisal, we have to think how appraisal kind of feeds into three, or is fed by three requirements. It's fed by producer expectations. Producer wants us to do something with their data. Then we have the user perspective. They expect it to be able to use the data in some way. They have needs. And there's also archival requirements, what the archive can actually do. And those three things don't always go hand in hand so well. And what we have to think about when thinking about appraisal is who decides when and based on what. Those are the questions, and those are not finite answers. Olivier said that trust is transient, but trust is also a moving target. Just because someone was certified as a trustworthy repository 15 years ago, I might not trust them today because they have changed their processes significantly since then. And there's other moving targets such as data value, custodianship, or technical requirements for data. So those are all things that we have to take into consideration when we think about formulating appraisal and reappraisal policies. So how can reappraisal balance producer expectations and consumer needs against archive capabilities? That will be my other impulse. And then my last one is based on file format perspective. I'm a full-time file format nerd, so I like talking about that. And a lot of you, I'm sure, come from institutions where you say, yeah, we prefer open and sustainable file formats, so we only accept like 5 file formats into our repository. This is going to make our lives easy. They're all open. We just use TIFF and PDF, which are as solid as I just showed you. And then we hope that, we will have to migrate sometime far in the future. We don't know when, and we don't want to worry about that now. So something I just want to state then is that strict file format policies, they're very common. especially for generic repositories and broader discipline repositories. However, what is not so common are processes for file format validation and technical metadata extraction. The idea behind this is by limiting ourselves to a few file formats, we have all our problems solved and we don't need to worry about what's actually in the files. And I would like to say that that is not at all the case. If we map it to the diagram that I showed earlier, it's something that comes very strictly speaking from archival requirements and capabilities. If I don't have enough person power and enough tools in my archive to actually conduct file format validation, well, then that is going to be my requirement, right? But the impulse statement connected to that is that strict file format policies do not prevent erroneous files, as I showed earlier. And the question that I want to pose is whether strict file format policies actually best serve producer expectations and consumer needs. So then this will be the summary of everything that I said for the impulse during the panel discussion. And with that, thank you.
Okay, my turn to wonder how this works. No. Okay, good afternoon from me as well. I'm not a member of the Data Retention Task Force. I'm actually a member of the FAIR Data Task Force, and maybe that's why I'm here. I think I'm also here because I want to talk about the new project, but I will start with some questions that I think are very important to address, and I think some things have already come up in this meeting here. For example, that the data repositories, they are key actors in the ecosystem, and they are especially key actors in preserving data for the long term. The current repository landscape is very diverse. For a good reason, maybe for some bad reasons as well, but most of the reasons I think are good. There is need for this diversity of repositories. We have different customers, we have different goals and different missions. The definition of a trustworthy digital repository is not something that would be a general agreement on. So there are several definitions really, and I'm not going to read them. You see some of them there are more. But it's really important to have a consensus in the EOSC context when we are building the landscape, when we are building the ecosystem. This is also relevant for assessing the trustworthiness of a repository. For example, when the funders tell the researchers that you must deposit your data with a trustworthy repository, so how will the researcher know where to go, really? And then one of the questions, and I think Oliver already touched a little bit on this, should a trustworthy digital repository have a certification, or are there other ways to assess the trustworthiness? So the project I want to mention is called Fidelis, as mentioned already by Olivier. This will start in January next year, and we will, in this project, build a network, a European network of trustworthy digital repositories. So this is a 3-year project, and we have a lot of goals in the project. They are really small here in the slide, but the slides will be shared. For today's discussion, I just want to focus on one of these goals, and that is the consensus of what constitutes a TDR in the European context. So we are going to hopefully solve that in the next 3 years. And we are planning to address this issue by providing an overall matrix of characteristics, functions, activities that are exhibited by a very broad range of repositories. So we actually have, I think, 24 partners in the project, and they represent, I would argue, hundreds of repositories. So we already have a pretty wide representation. But in addition, the project will have an outreach program, a support program. So we are hoping to involve much more repositories from different fields, different kind of repositories. I think it's important to note that we expect to build on current practices, so we are not going to build a new certification, or we will build on existing solutions. And I think that's in short what I wanted to say about Fidelis project. I'm really happy to hear your views on about trustworthiness, certification, the repository collaboration, the network, and how we can support each other in building this ecosystem for the researchers. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three speakers. So I'm now going to invite them to take their place on the stage. Yeah. So we're going to have the Slido on the screen as well. So if there are any questions from the audience at home, we'll be able to have a look at both of those. So let's start with a question from the room, if we have one. Okay, everybody's looking at the QR code. I was like, yes, we've loads of questions. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question then. So something that came up in kind of all three of the talks was, where does long-term start? So I'm going to ask you guys this question. When does long-term start? Olivier, do you want to consider that?
Yeah, well, I think that I gave kind of first answer in the slides, right? I mean, as soon as you have risks associated to your data objects, long term is the milestone where you will need to put some stuff in place to avoid or to mitigate the impact of these risks. I mean, PDF, when they are well generated, like PDF-A, for example, can last 30, 40 years without any problems. So that would be long-term. Other digital objects with different file formats would require curation in a shorter period. So I would say that your long term would be 10 years, 15. So that can vary from a repository to another. So that there's no one size fits all, right?
Mickey, Mari, either of you want to jump in on that one?
So for me, long term actually starts at the point in time when I have to take responsibility for something within my infrastructure. However, I think the amount of work that you put into it scales. But I would never blindly rely on a file format. I think there needs to be a very solid initial appraisal mechanism which doesn't just take into consideration contextual and semantic aspects of the digital object, but also technical ones. And once I'm convinced that my PDF file is fine, for example, then I can store it. And I can store it for 5 years or 10 years or 25 years. And what I need to do is I need to have a risk catalog of how risky the data is that I have based on file format criteria. And then kind of weigh the amount of work that I have to put into that against the retention time. So it's something that scales. There's, like all of you said, I agree that there's no one size fits all solution, but I also think that within one institution that has different retention periods, there's no one size fits all solution for all of my data within my repository then either. It needs to be a much more differentiated approach than it currently is.
So I will add, I agree with both of you, but I will add that, well, I come from a social science data archive, and we deal with humans, with people, and data about people. So I think the long term starts when you start planning the research. You need to, at that stage, you need to take steps to guarantee that you can share the data in the first place, and then we can talk about preserving it for the reuse for the long term. So it's all about good data management planning from day zero.
I think that kind of ties back into my Berlin Wall example of, you know, what is long term and when does appraisal and reappraisal happen. And I suppose depending on the risks, that may happen to happen very frequently. Okay, I'm going to have a quick look up at the Slido. So we have a question from Paul Stokes. Hi, Paul. Trust is transitive, time-dependent, and context-dependent. I think that's more of a comment than a question, per se. Okay, so, and then Paul goes on to say, the fact that I trust you to preserve a PDF and potentially trust someone you trust doesn't mean that I trust your endorsement of a restaurant, for instance. Okay, all excellent points. Okay, so one actual question. Long-term also differs whether it's an academic question or based in practice. What does this definition try to solve? So that's from somebody who is in the room. If you would like to identify yourself, please do. Okay, so do you want to ask your question again to the panel?
Yeah. Thank you very much. So the question is really, why do we want or need to attach this attribute long-term to something? So we might have a reason or a need to approach, and usually it means who will be responsible for this, who should take care of the data, and in the end also, of course, who will pay for all this effort that has been taken. So I think there's two both worthwhile discussions to have. The one is, what does long-term mean on a really philosophical perspective? And I think Mickey has something very important there, that long-term is very relative and starts very early. And the other thing is based very much in practice. And there one could say there's a minimum definition of long-term, and I might throw one into the room. And I would say things are at least then long-term if the responsibility will change. So as long as somebody else is responsible for the thing, it's perhaps not long-term, but at the moment the responsibility changes, it is definitely long-term. And this ties very much into the discussion of the risks that are attached to that, because those breaks are where risks happen, or at least where we realize that something has happened.
Would have any of you like to comment?
Yeah, I very much agree with what you said. And I come from, a library and archive, so information science background. And it's something that libraries and archives have been doing forever. There's a collection policy that informs what goes into your archive, may it be digital or analog, it doesn't matter. And then there's a national strategy that ensures that, nobody gets rid of the last copy. And it's a very similar approach that we have to take to data too, right? So I think that's where the EOSC notes can really help in having a federated overview of who stores what and who takes on that responsibility. And as long as long-term is considered early on, or at least data is treated that way, I think we're on a good track.
Well, I agree with that, but I will also add, again, repeating myself, that you can't move the responsibility to somebody else unless you have the rights for that. And for that, you probably need to start the planning already before that moment happens. So what we see in a social science data archive, so researchers, they do die. We all do die. And then who then has the rights to that data? Who can say who owns the data in a way? And I mean, that's an ongoing debate. I don't think we can go into that here. But this is all part of the complex landscape where we live in, and where the repositories are key actors in that they can solve these issues and they can find solutions together with the research community.
All right, and I agree as well with what's been said. I think that the term long-term has been introduced to kind of justify the need for the highest level of care to the data, because you're the last entity to be responsible for it.
So I'm going to use my privilege as chair and ask one of the questions, which I spotted up here, which I really, really love. And when does research data become cultural heritage data? And the reason that I have a particular interest in this is I used to work at the Irish Social Science Data Archive, so working with social science data. I was based in UCD Library, where we also had a cultural heritage digital library. And I said this to my colleagues one day: the data that I am managing and preserving will be the cultural heritage data of the future. And they were horrified. But I really think there is a point at which this becomes a record of our society as it is today, and that becomes our cultural heritage data. So I'm interested to see if any of the panel also have thoughts on that. So when does research data become cultural heritage data?
Well, I think when it is connected to something that, like you said, significantly impacts society in some way. So the initial paper written about Bitcoin, for example, right? That is already considered cultural heritage. Or the original papers written about the structure behind the internet. Those will be considered cultural heritage because it's something that really changed the world. So that is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is based on, so connected to a person, like a researcher. Based from university archives, for example, if the researcher had a significant impact on the university might already consider the legacy of that researcher once they retire to be taken into their archives in entirety, including all research data, because that is considered at least some kind of institutional heritage, which might eventually be cultural heritage as well.
Mario or Olivier, do either of you want to have a think about that?
So I was thinking again from the social science perspective. So we, for example, have something we call qualitative data. So, for example, textual collections, writings, and so on. And I think they are cultural heritage from the beginning.
Yeah, I would agree. With the archive that I was managing, we had the Growing Up in Ireland study, which was looking at children, 2 different cohorts of children, 10 years apart. And that cohort of children was returned to every couple of years. And to me, that is just a snapshot of time in Ireland. And I think that, to me, seems to be culture. I think it's worth preserving. Not everything is worth preserving indefinitely, but something like that definitely is. Do we have any questions in the room? Yes?
Thank you. Yeah, I am Javier Lopez from the European Commission. I am largely ignorant on these topics as a good policy maker, and I would like to thank you for the presentations because they were very clear in indicating what are the main issues, topics, so they help a lot with understanding the problem. My question that I can help thinking of, given the context and also referring back to a previous comment by Mickey, is all these problems about data retention they are discussing, more conceptual, more practical. How do you think that EOSC can help in solving or addressing them, the long term? What are the kind of ideas that you have in the back of your minds? Are you thinking about data retention policies? Are you thinking of infrastructural support to gain capacity for storage, processing, curation? A little bit, how do you see this big problem solved, or how can, the other way around, how can the EOSC and the Federation in particular as an infrastructure help solving all these problems? What is your view? Thank you.
Okay, I'll start. The biggest issue that I can see is about the resources that you will need to do that retention or preservation, right? Even if there are services existing to preserve data, we are talking about a recurrent budget, right? That you need to have year after year. Okay, we've seen that we will have 500 credits to use EOSC services. Will that be enough to preserve data over time? I doubt it. So we need to step up, move forward, and have another policy on that, obviously. So where should that come from? Interesting question.
And even the cost of appraisal and reappraisal.
Yeah, well, that's part of the process anyway.
Yeah.
On my last slide, I highlighted that some of the issues we will be looking at as part of the EOSC Eden project. And when I showed the slide about archival capabilities, consumer needs, and consumer needs and producer expectations, I think it will really help to insert background about producer expectations into wherever the data lives, right? Like data management plans, for example, could they contextualize how you store data? I think the EOSC, the nodes can help with assessing moving targets such as the value of the data, how often is it used, for example. It can also help highlight if it's already redundantly stored. I think from a European perspective, it will be very helpful to have key data stored in many different countries and not just in one country. And that is something where EOS can really support that for any kind of data, essentially. And what is currently missing is expert archive nodes that can plug into the infrastructure. And those need to come from stakeholders who are very familiar with the archiving process, because there's a lot of file format expertise that needs to be fed into that too. So those are the missing pieces, but I think they can all fit into a larger federated infrastructure. So as part of EOSC Eden, one of the things we're looking at is how repositories or archives can report out through APIs their technical capabilities that they currently have for handling different file formats.
So I agree that well, my expectation is that we can share the good practices. And this has already proven very helpful in the context of CESTA, for example, that has been sharing good practices on digital preservation for 50 years now for the benefit of all the CESTA data archives, the service providers. Another thing that came to mind was hopefully some sort of coordination. So maybe, I mean, we've heard a lot that the funding, there's not going to be more money. The funding has to come from the states, the countries. But what if there is a data set that is really valuable and it is in a country that doesn't really see that value? So I would expect the EOSC can come find a solution to preserving, sharing that kind of data that is of value to a larger community, but where the individual country probably wouldn't have the resources or interest to maintain that data.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. So let's go to a question on the Slido from an anonymous person. We can't archive everything for the long term. So who decides what data is worthy for long-term archiving? The researchers, the funders? I would add into that the domain experts, the archivists, librarians.
Yeah, I think that's a relevant question, and also on what level. So coming back to my previous example, maybe the decisions should be made at least on some cases on European level, and then some cases maybe institutional level, national level. But I don't have a definite answer to that. But I will say that I believe in the economies of scale here, so I think there should be some sort of coordination.
Any other thoughts on who is best placed to curate these data?
I think I showed that there's different handover periods that are possible too, so there will always be different kind of appraisal processes. Those need to go hand in hand. I think it is also something that the EOSC infrastructure can help with in collecting the requirements for how important data is to different stakeholders, and I think that comes from policymakers as well as from the researchers themselves. So it comes from many different stakeholders.
True. I mean, you have some legal policies that you cannot avoid. These are defined generally at national levels. So archivists will be key to make sure that everything's fine with regard to that. And then you will have the researcher or that will be able to do the appraisal of the scientific quality, and then that's a team effort to define what needs to be preserved or not.
Yeah, and at the risk of doing curation by committee, I think it's also important to recognise that we are humans and we have biases that can make their way into the decisions that we make around some of these things. Okay, so let's go back to the room again. Any further questions? Yeah.
So my name is Liva, University of Oslo, and I want to say that on my guilty list is the lack of a policy for which researchers' data and how this should be managed at the university. I think the question that was up there before about who decides what to keep, I think that is extremely personal and political questions at every university. And it's something we should have at the university level. We don't have it. And I just want to know if there are anybody who has a perfect example that I can use as a draft, because it is on my eternal to-do list. And I think it's something that we could work together on sharing practices on, because it is necessary to identify now those who are still alive, because we can't do, as I was told by the National Library, well, now it's a few years back, when we asked them if they could save a collection of a living researcher, and he had some material, and they said, well, we don't really start dealing with researchers until they have been dead for 150 years. And we're like, well, the material won't be around then. So how can we do this active, and who has a good policy that I can borrow from?
Okay, so I'm going to throw that open to our panel, but also to the floor as well. If anybody has a good policy that they would like to share, or is aware of a good policy, but I'll send that to the panel first.
Okay, I'll start then. So in my institution at CNRS, we do have such a policy. It's in agreement that we have with the National Archive. It basically lists all type of asset that a researcher can produce. This goes from meeting notes to reports, to data sets, etc., etc. And for each of these type of assets, you have a retention period, and what you need to do after that period is achieved, right? That could be deletion or preservation, okay? It's public. You can find it online, but it's in French. I'm sorry. But you can easily translate it, I suppose.
Did anybody from the floor want to, examples of good practice?
So I'm from the German Aerospace Center, and as you can imagine, we have vast amounts of data of different kinds. And there is, I would say, regulated data, for example, meeting notes of the board of directors and whatever. Those go into the German Federal Archive for whatever reasons, and those will be stored even after the nuclear apocalypse. Whatever, this has been a decision by the higher ups. What about the scientific data? And I had a lot of discussions with our colleagues from different levels of involvement, and also distance from science towards management. And one thing that has been common is there won't be a solution that will please everybody, but there might be a solution that annoys the least people. And this, again, tends to go into decision by committee. But as long as the committee is relevant to the ones who are obliged to listen to that. And I've spoken with Wille, who had a really excellent idea, and they implemented this. And we try to do this similarly at our center. And obviously it won't look the same, but it's again, the scientists responsible decide over their data in a committee. And perhaps I would really like to ask you whether you want to elaborate on this.
Yes, please.
We are talking about this, currently we call it data bank of the University of Helsinki. And there is a process that a researcher have a data which could comes from different phases of the research process. And if they have a reason to store it pretty much longer, 5 to 15 years or something, then they have to apply this storage space, and and they have to give metadata and fulfill these requirements of the data bank, and also give to university this kind of collaborative rights to handle data. So this ownership is, after the storing, is shared between university and the researcher and so on. This process is, it was a little bit hard to implement, but anyway, we have that one. Nina is actually from the data bank team now, and okay, I'm doing something else right now. But anyway, but yeah. We have this kind of process, but it's not a technical thing. Technology is simple. That okay, storing the data, it's not a difficult one. But this processing, that how to handle these university requirements and how to handle the researcher requirements, and how to combine all of these things. Did I answer your question?
I think so, and hopefully now you have a couple of examples to start from. So I think we have time for one last question from the floor. Yes, woman at the back.
Thank you very much, Alexandra Butner. First of all, thanks for the presentations. I think that was a brilliant introduction. I actually have a question more regarding the researchers and users' perspective, because a lot of work goes into preparing your data to have it long-term archived, and a lot of work goes into the repositories who need to apply for a core trust seal, and a lot of work goes into actually preserving the data. And I'm always surprised that a user, when he actually, if you call up a data set, you can't actually see how much work has gone into it. Is it long-term preserved? And I know in Germany they do have a mark field where you have one string where you can say it's long-term archived. But as a user, you need to know, okay, you need to click on the mark 21, tag, and then you need to find
Nobody wants to do that.
300 something.
Even the librarians.
Why don't we? Why is it not visible for users, and why couldn't one use it as a quality statement? And I know it's difficult, and I thought the slides were so brilliant, showing long-term preservation. What does it mean? 5 years, 10 years? So I do see that it's tricky to put a statement like that on it, because often the institutions don't know themselves for how long they can commit. Yeah. But still, I wonder, can't a researcher put something in his publication saying, look, I've worked really hard. I've done everything that I can. And why don't the repositories actually, when data is aggregated, put something in the metadata? So anyway, that's my question, and what I'd like to hear what others think about it.
Fantastic. I think recognition of researcher effort is a huge part of what we are trying to do with this giant culture change, giant culture shift as well. But I'm interested to hear if any of our panelists have any thoughts.
I think it would be very beneficial connected directly to the data. I agree. So currently, if you have larger platforms like We3 Data, for example, they at least allow you to search for certified repositories, domain-specific ones. And based on the deposit criteria that they have in there, it kind of hints a little bit at the work that goes into it. But I think it would be helpful to have something that wouldn't require quite as much information to have to wade through. So I agree with you that it's very beneficial. I don't have an answer on how that can be easily achieved, though, unfortunately.
Jacques, did I see you had your hand up? Yes, would you like to, as my co-chair, I'm going to give you the floor with the last question.
Thank you. So I had one question, which was when you mentioned that we have the users, we have the repositories, and we have, well, those that deposit the data. But what about the, let's say, the developers of the instruments that scientists use to create their data? A lot of the times this determines the format that they're going to use, or even the interpretability of that data. But I haven't seen that there's much effort contacting these individuals, people that make microscopes, people that make even behavioral boxes for animals. If we really targeted at this spot, we could take care of, okay, what metadata is already going to be collected without even having to have the researchers do it. Is this too difficult?
So it's a question that has been discussed in the digital preservation domain for like 25 years. I will give you an example based on emulation. We would all think that emulation is something rather easy to solve, right? So the German National Library tried to contact, I think, Apple, Microsoft, and specific Linux distributions about being able to use their software in their reading room only. And Microsoft got back fairly quickly. Apple, I think they had to go through like 3 letters actually being written by lawyers to Apple to even have them allow them to use it in their reading rooms. And it's something that it faces a lot of the same problems that we have everywhere. The producers don't want to, or the software producers don't want to share their business secrets, of course, right? To them, it's a business model that data becomes obsolete and that data is faulty. That's another thing. Then they're located all across the globe, so it makes it very hard to have a common legal framework to bind them to the requirements. Often they're very small companies and they disappear very quickly and you can't find them anymore. And then they are dependent on third-party libraries within their software, so they don't even have the liberty to change things. So that makes it incredibly complicated. It's a great idea, and it has been discussed many times, but it doesn't work quite as easily. I would hope that will work for research software, the software that we produce ourselves, right? And that is something where we do need to have higher standards, I think, and those need to feed into archival requirements as well.
Do either of our other 2 panelists want to? I mean, I can see how excited you got about that question, which is wonderful. So with that, I'm going to close the session. Thank you very much to all of you here in the room and online for your attention, for your listening, and for your really thought-provoking questions. And in particular, thank you to our 3 panelists this afternoon. Enjoy your coffee break.